For this lesson, we are going to add and subtract fractions that do not share the same denominator. The steps are very similar to the previous lesson. The only thing that's different is that we need to find a common denominator. So let's do example 1. It says rewrite subtraction as addition if necessary. For this problem, I do need to do that. Instead of 3/8 minus negative 1/4, I need to change it to adding the opposite, or keep change. So 3/8, oh, sorry about that. I'm going to write 3/8 plus, because I changed my subtraction, and I changed this negative 1/4 to a positive 1/4. So I rewrote subtraction as addition. Step 2 says to rename the fractions using the least common denominator. So when I look at 8 and 4, I want to try to figure out what is the least common multiple. So when I write out my multiples of 8, I would have 8, 16. I'm going to stop there because I really don't need to go any further. And if I were to write out the multiples of 4, I would have 4 and then 8. Well, the first number that these two have in common is 8. You could use a larger number, but you're going to have really large fractions. So we want to try to use the least common denominator if we can identify it. So my common denominator here is 8. 3/8, there's nothing to change. However, in order to make 1/4 have a denominator of 8, I need to multiply 4 times 2. And whatever I do to the denominator, I also need to do to the numerator. So when I rewrite my two fractions, I now have 3/8 plus 2/8. Now it's just like the previous lesson. The signs are the same, so I know I need to add. 3 plus 2 gives me 5, and I'm going to write that over my common denominator, which is 8. Both fractions were positive, so I know my final solution is positive 5/8. This problem does not need to be rewritten as a mixed number because the numerator is smaller than the denominator. And I cannot simplify this fraction, so I'm actually done. 3/8 minus negative 1/4, my final solution is 5/8. Now let's move on to example 2. I do not need to rewrite this fraction because it is already addition. Step 2 says to rename the fractions using the least common denominator. So if I write out my multiples of 6, I have 6, 12, and 18. If I write out my multiples of 9, I have 9 and then 18. I can identify that the least common denominator between these two fractions is 18. So this time we're going to have to change both fractions. So instead of negative 5/6, when I look at 6, I need to multiply 6 times 3 in order to turn it into 18. So I'm going to do the same thing to the denominator. When I look at 9, I need to multiply 9 times 2 in order to get 18. So again, I'm going to do the exact same thing to the numerator. So now let's rewrite those fractions. Make sure you keep your negative signs. So that was a negative 5/6, but instead it is now a negative 15/18. And actually, I'm going to change that to blue so that I stay consistent with my colors. So again, that was negative 15/18. Plus 4 times 2 gives me 8, and it was negative, so I got to make sure I keep that negative 18. All right, now I need to determine if I need to add or subtract. Well, the signs are the same, so because they have the same sign, I need to add. So let's do it. 15 plus 8 gives me 22. And then I need to keep the denominator, which is 18. Both fractions are negative, so I know that my final answer is negative 22/18. However, the numerator is larger than the denominator, so I need to change it to a mixed number. And I do that by dividing. 18 can go into 22 one time. I have a remainder of 4. So my final answer, or my answer, is negative 1 4/18. But when I look at my fractional part, it's even. Both numbers are even, so they can both be simplified. I can divide them both by 2. That is kind of unclear. But 4 divided by 2 is 2. 18 divided by 2 is 9. Can't simplify any further, so that's my final answer. Go ahead and try the practice problem.